Okay, we're going to wait a second or two to be sure everybody is properly in the virtual house. And such a warm welcome to have you here, all future lawyer linguists who are joining today's webinar on this great opportunity that EPSO, the European Personnel Selection Office, has just published. And very glad to have you here. This is live on Monday morning. Well, not so morning, but on Monday from the Ambioric studio in Brussels. And it's a pleasure to have you all. So until everybody gets properly into the virtual meeting room, why don't you type into the chat box where you are dialing in from so we can see the geographic diversity of our audience today. And while you're doing that, you are also getting yourself familiarized with the chat box, which you can definitely use throughout today's webinar to ask questions, and I will answer as many as I can live, though this is also a recording, so you may get the response afterwards if you send that in through the different platforms or channels. And I see that there are already France, Brussels, Slovenia, different places, different wonderful cities and countries. That's very well. So we're going to get started. And here is the event ID for those of you who may have some technical difficulties listening to me or seeing the screen. You can download the app, but usually using a different browser on your computer or even on your phone would solve the problem and make sure that everything works smoothly. So that's the event ID at the bottom, or refreshing the browser usually solves it. So with that, we are going to get started because we have a lot to cover. And this is a new competition for lawyer linguists, but also new in the sense that there are many new variables and components that you need to be aware of. So I'm going to go through each of those. About myself, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. You can find me on LinkedIn. You are much encouraged and welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share many news, ideas, and thoughts that I come up with. And also, you may want to check out the Ultimate EU Handbook, which has just been released a couple of weeks ago, which covers everything on the EU's history, procedures, and the institutions. And on our very own EU training website, you also have briefings which supplement the contents of the book, which cover EU policies. And this is relevant for this particular competition because EU knowledge is now part of this particular competition, as we're going to cover in a few moments. So with that, let's get started. As I said, recording will be made available and the transcript as well in a couple of days later, and also the slides as you see them on the screen as such. About EU training, many of you are customers, clients currently. Those of you who are new to this, we are providing EPSO and EU career preparation tests and exams. We have a wonderful community of tens of thousands of people on different platforms and on our own. We publish all the news and information when it comes to EU careers and EPSO exams. We have an impressive number of multiple choice and other types of questions that help you prepare for the competitions. And 17 million, that's a large number of how many questions have been used by our clients over the many years that we are in business, and thousands of them are already EU officials. And that makes us very happy. Also, there are lots of webinars. Many are free, others are paid, on different methodologies and different aspects and different components of the EU careers and EPSO exams. And there's much more to discover. I'll talk about that later, but I really want to be sure that I cover all the components of this particular competition. So we're going to go through all these elements one by one. The competition, so the reference number 423 of the 2025, that is the reference number for all different linguistic profiles that you are going to be enrolled in, but this is the main number that you will be using as a reference. And there are different language profiles, as I said earlier, and there are different number of places on the reserve list. So that's important to mention that these are reserve list places, which is a benchmark. Well, that's the number that they're going to fill up, but that is a benchmark based on the specific needs of the various recruiting institutions that will hire you in the end into a particular job. So this is not the number of vacancies. though again, that is very closely correlated to the actual number of places that the institutions want to fill it. As you see, broadly comparable. English is slightly higher because of the importance of the English language, but certainly all others have 25 places, as you see from Slovenian, Romanian, Dutch, and many others, which we're going to go through the linguistic regime because that has a big impact on the language in which you are required to take the exam in. And the total number of places, 208. Now, where are you going to work? Well, almost certainly Brussels, though technically speaking, possible that the work is in Luxembourg. Not much Strasbourg because practically there's not much happening there outside of the plenary sessions that happen once a month typically. But again, in terms of employment, it's essentially Brussels and to some degree it might be Luxembourg. Now, what is it that you're going to do? Interestingly, the notice of competition doesn't mention that you need to translate legal translations in the first place, but you need to do basically everything else based on the text that will have been translated by the time it lands on your desk. So there are all 8 language profiles. First is revision of translations. So legal texts that have been translated and based on 2 languages, and then check legal and linguistic integrity of the text, consistency of the text, and also advise on legislative drafting, which means you are not exactly a legal advisor, but again, more the drafting ins and outs is something that your advice would be sought. And also following the legislative process. So obviously you need to have an in-depth understanding of the different steps of the EU legislative processes, whether that's co-decision, ordinary legislative procedure, all the way to the other types of special legislative procedures and beyond. And then working with legal and linguistic experts in the institutions to find the right terminology and make sure that the text that you are dealing with, be that regulations, directives, decisions, and any number of other formats or types of legal texts, that those are properly and linguistically coherent between and among the different languages. Now, there are some basic criteria, as it happens for every EPSO competition, that you need to fill. And on a very basic level, you need to be an EU citizen. You need to have fulfilled the military service, if that's a requirement in your particular country of citizenship, which may not be the same as your residence, but of your citizenship. And then meeting the character requirements that are necessary for the job. And that might also mean that you need to pass maybe additional security clearance if you might be dealing with highly sensitive or confidential documents as well. And then specific requirements are the most relevant, perhaps, to most candidates, because that's where a great diversity happens in terms of your background, your languages, your qualifications, and work experience. So let's go through those. But before we do that, I just want to highlight the tool that was introduced about a year ago or so by EPSO for all competitions, trying to minimize applicants and applications who manifestly do not qualify for a specific competition. So this is a non-consequential tool. It's more of an optional, or perhaps they make you go through it, but it doesn't have a legal or practical consequence if you don't pass it, though it's, again, more of an evaluation tool, because the point is to go through those basic questions and be sure that you really have the basic qualification and other formal criteria, you meet those. So for instance, if you're not an EU citizen, it immediately shows you that you don't qualify. Or if you don't have a degree in law, but in engineering, again, it's a manifest disqualification reason. So having said that, let's take a look at the language rules, because that is crucial, not just because it's a lawyer-linguist competition, but it also has a big impact on your choice of languages, and that has an impact on your exam performance. Why? Because the kind of test that you are taking will have a language connected to it. So it's predetermined in which language you will take one test or another. And if you are really a polyglot and you speak multiple languages, which in this case, you need to have 3 languages at least, and it doesn't hurt if you have more. Now, obviously, that's not that common, but you need to have the 3 languages, and you need to, or you want to be smart on which one you pick as 1, 2, or 3. Though in certain cases, there are predetermined languages, or there's a predetermined language, namely English, as language 1 or language 2. So let's look at those and be sure that the rules are clear. Now, this is the point where I remind you, as I always do, that the true source of authority is the notice of competition. So while we do our very best to cross-check whatever we share with you, and we want to be sure that we are accurate to the degree that's humanly possible, we still might make mistakes, and I might say something which is not 100% the way it is in the notice of competition. So it's a notice of competition that you need to rely on and be sure that those provisions are the ones that you take into account. So with that, language 1. So language 1 is your chosen language profile. So basically, that's a native level language. Now, I usually give my own example. Perhaps it's not perceived as selfish. It's more as a relatable example that all of you can apply for your particular circumstance. Being Hungarian, I probably would choose as language 1 Hungarian. Now, I do have or would have the liberty to choose English. I could even choose French. I could choose basically any language that I consider to speak as native level, and as long as it's among the languages of the competition. That is to say that this is not predetermined by any certificate or qualification, and it's not even determined by your passport. So that is your choice, but certain rules apply there. And because of that, you need to be careful which one you pick, especially if you perhaps have the citizenship of one country, but you got your legal degree in another, and then you live in another country, or you have grown up in another country and you speak that language fluently, which is not unheard of in Europe or in the world for that matter. So you need to carefully look at the combination or the mix of those to make sure that you properly qualify and you have made the right choice of language. Now, language 2 is English for 7 profiles, except for the English. So that is an exception, as we will see. So if you're Danish, if you are any of the other languages, then you need to speak and write and communicate and possess English as language 2. Language 3 is another official EU language, different from language 1 and 2. So that is your language 3, which needs to be on or at least the requirement is that it doesn't need to be fluent. It has to be good enough. It has to be kind of a solid linguistic knowledge, but it doesn't need to be native level. So again, if you put all your languages together, and English being one of them, in that case, English as language 2 will be predetermined, except the scenario if you pick English as the exam profile as language 1, because then English will be language 1. So in that case, that is the special scenario where English is language 1, but you need to speak English and write in English at native level. So because of your studies, because of your having watched a lot of cartoons, though cartoons don't have a lot of legal terminology in them, typically, unless it's a legal cartoon, which I don't think it exists. It needs to be really very, very solid. Language 2, in that case, can be any official EU language other than English, and then language 3, again, another language. So again, take my example. Here I could pick English as language 1, and then language 2 could be Hungarian, language 3 could be French, for that matter. So I would have the liberty to do that. But then again, come the next set of criteria about the degrees and diplomas, which makes the choice a little more predetermined, as we will see in a second. So I hope that is clear about the linguistic regime. It's not particularly complex. Maybe it's perceived as such, but I think it's fairly straightforward. Now, the qualifications is where it gets more tricky. And as I said, that is what might limit your actual choice based on where you got your degree or your diploma from. So you must hold a university degree in law. That's clear, from the country corresponding to the language of the competition, right? And that is what might limit your choice, because if you got your degree in Denmark, well, chances are that you're going to be you are obliged to pick Danish as your language one. So that has a big impact on what you may or may not choose. And then the degree must qualify you to practice law in that particular country, or provide legal expertise. Now, again, our interpretation, and based on all the other signals and indications in the notice of competition, it doesn't mean you need to have passed the bar exam, for instance. So having the degree is sufficient to qualify for the competition. And they also provide information on the number of years your degree had required. So if it's a 4-year degree, then no additional work experience is required. And then a 3-year degree requires 1 year of relevant legal experience. So that is important, because if you have a bachelor degree and then you need to demonstrate that you have 1 year of specific and relevant legal experience, at least, to be able to qualify for the exam. For the English language profile, there are more requirements, which we would just simply refer you to point 333 in the notice of competition, because obviously English language degrees and then English language, or let's say the Anglo-Saxon legal system is different. So that becomes a little more complex, and we would refer you to those very specific provisions if that situation is the one that applies to you. Now, moving on, the qualifications. So the 1-year professional experience is relevant, and there are a couple of indicators that certainly you need to have received that after your degree. So if you were a law clerk or legal intern during your studies, that's not going to qualify. That's not going to be considered. And also, if it's 1-year legal experience as a lawyer, and you could have been self-employed or employed, or in a private practice or public institution, perhaps a civil servant, or even international institution, but you need to have worked in a legal position. So if you got your law degree, but then you worked as a marketing manager, that's not going to qualify you for this particular competition. Now, I'll pause here for a second, and I take a look whether there are questions coming in, and I encourage you to do that. Please put your questions into the chat box so I can answer them. Though so far there seem to be more listening than writing. So I'll take that opportunity to get a sip of water, and while you are gathering your thoughts, and I see Dora has a question, so Dora, go ahead and type that into the box. Okay, while Dora is doing that, I perhaps will cover some other points. I'll let you type that into the box, and I'll pause again in a couple of moments to answer the questions to the best of my abilities. Oh, actually, it's already in, so why don't I answer it from Jana? Jana, what if somebody obtained a master's degree in law in less than 3 years? Well, a master's degree presupposes the existence of a bachelor degree, which already qualifies you for the 3 years of degree. So master's degree can be in 1 year, as it often happens, like in the College of Europe or elsewhere. Then as long as you have a bachelor, which presumably you have as a precondition, then you are good. And then I have to write something in, okay, the questions are disappearing, so I'll let my colleagues filter them and pass them through to me on my other device. And while they do that, I will go on and cover this particular section in the slides. Why is this a great opportunity? Those of you who are new to EU jobs and EU careers would certainly want to know that this is more than just a prestigious and high-profile work and job. There are also good benefits. So there is a great health insurance that comes with the job. There are also European schools. If you have children or planning to have children, well, they can go and study in your own language, so to say, again, within the constraints of the EU official languages, and attractive salaries. So the salary is very, very high, proportionate to the level of requirements or the level of position that this particular job profile grants. And we have a salary calculator on our website, which you can check out. It's a free tool. You can enter the different variables. We did a simulation for you. And the interesting thing is that this is an AD7 job. And for those of you who are following EU careers in general, would notice that the number of years of work experience being very limited, or even no work experience being required, and then having an AD7 position, it's a pretty generous offer, because most candidates without any work experience start on AD5 level, not on AD7 level. So you might be asking why is it so? And the reason is that lawyer linguists are sometimes not that easy to hire, and not that easy to find, and not that easy to fill those vacancies in some languages, and there are many other factors that play into that. And this is like an extra incentive where lawyer linguists are hired into an AD7 position from the get-go. And that actually is reflected in the salary, which is then much higher than an AD5 salary would be. And as you see on the screen, that roughly is an 8,700 euro net salary, plus the other benefits I mentioned, which gives a bit more context into why the position is at that level, while the work experience that's required is minimal or none is required. Right. So before I go to the competition phases and we go through each steps and the exams, I take a quick look at the questions, which I encourage you, and you certainly heard my call and put in many questions. So here's one from Mitko that says, shall language 2 and language 3 be proven with a language certificate? The answer is no. So no language certificate is required in EPSO exams. That's why they subject you to the particular exams that we're going to cover in the next few minutes. But there's no formal requirement there's no requirement for any formal qualification of any kind for the linguistic knowledge. That doesn't concern the education, where of course you need a formal diploma. But for the language, demonstrating your linguistic knowledge, you don't need that. Next one from Nadine. So I have 7 months legal experience, but 1 year as a policy advisor. Can I be eligible? I think, yeah, that can be tricky. Depends on what policy advisor meant in your particular circumstances. So if that was maybe creating briefings and dealing with, say, environment policy or trade or similar, possibly not. But if the policy advisor actually meant legal advice or similar tasks, it may fly. So that can be subject to interpretation, and you want to do everything to get the right, maybe the job description or the title that you held at the time, to really prove your point and make sure that you justify your eligibility. From Julia, what language is better to choose for the application, English or language 1, for example, Romanian? For practical purposes, you might want to choose English, but the actual application interface is multilingual. You can do it in either of the 24 languages. So you can choose either of those. Again, for practical purposes, already thinking about the recruitment part, because we're talking about the selection here, but the recruitment part, it might make the recruiter's life easier. One way or another, though, as a general piece of advice, I would say English. But in this particular case, since you are going to be hired into a linguistic position where the person hiring you almost certainly is fluent, if not native, in that particular language, in that case, you probably want to actually choose language 1, because the hiring person will have an easier time reading your profile in that particular language. Okay, what's the timeline for receiving a contract once you pass an exam? That largely depends on vacancies and some other variables. It can be very fast if they have a shortage in a particular language, which often happens based on staff turnover or other factors. And it can take a couple of months. So my personal example, back then I was a lawyer linguist, and I was hired a month after the reservist came out. But that was very particular circumstances, because Hungary had just joined the EU back in 2004, and they desperately needed to fill those vacancies based on those who were on the reserve list. Okay, I see a couple other questions are coming in. We're going to try to get to those, but I just want to move on with the process and the different steps. So application process is broadly covered so far, and then we're going to look at the EPSO tests, and then spend a little time on the eligibility checks, but that usually happens in the background. That doesn't concern you, other than you having sent in the necessary qualifications. And then ultimately, there's a reserve list, which I trust and hope that most and a large number of you will be on it. So then you become recruitable. Now, step one is the application process, very straightforward. You do it in the EPSO portal. They've recently updated it and revised the system. So essentially, you need to do it once, create an account and a profile, and then you can handle your applications to other competitions where you may want to participate in case you want to increase your chances or there are other competitions where you qualify. But then you still have a single portal or a single profile that you create. And the application process, you can do it in any of the 24 languages. Like we said earlier, you upload the supporting documents, but that can be done later. So that's good news because it may take time for you to get hold of your degree, or if any sort of equivalence or similar process needs to be done, then it gives you enough time to do that. But it certainly needs to be done within the deadline. And the deadline is 10th of April for the application, but it's 15th of September for the degrees. So you do have a lot of time, but get started with the process because administrations, bureaucracies can often take a long time to process your request if that is necessary for you to take care of. And then the tests. So all applicants who submit their applications and do all the formalities properly, you will be invited to take the test. They are not doing any screening or any other selection beyond that, making sure that you properly qualify. You will be invited to the test. And the tests are always done remotely, and you can take that at home. You can take that right here at the Amberic Center because we have a wonderful team and we have space with secure internet and all the right gear that provides you a good environment to sit in, and you only need to focus on the exam, but you don't need to focus on anything else. We take care of that for you. That's a paid service, but if that is your desire, we are more than happy to help in Brussels. But the tests are not done in any other test center because those are no longer used. And then failure to complete any of the tests will result in disqualification. So you need to go through each and every step, whether or not you produced a good result or not, or how you feel while you're taking that. You need to go through the entire process because the missing any component will disqualify you from the rest. Pretty straightforward, pretty standard. Now, the kind of tests that this particular competition has is somewhat more unique, or let's say has changed over the years. So I'm going to present you the 4 components that you need to take. And these are the 4 tests that you will need to take on a single day on the exam day. And the exam day is the same day for everyone. So for all candidates, everyone who's enrolled in this particular competition will need to take the test on the same day. As I said, using your own device, or if your device is not compatible, you need to make sure that you have a computer where you have admin rights to be able to install the right software and sit the test. So there's an EU law test, then there's a language comprehension test, then there are reasoning skill tests and a revision test. So let's go through each of these of what that actually includes. Now, the reasoning skills is the most straightforward, and the good news is that it's a pass or fail exam. You are not ranked on this, and the different components are added together. So the verbal, numerical, and abstract, which is probably good news for most of us lawyers and let's say more verbally minded folks, and no offense to those who are more numerically minded folks, where the abstract verbal numerical score is taken as 1 and the pass mark is 50%. Verbal reasoning, you basically have 10 questions and 18 minutes. Classic in many ways. There's text passage, questions, statements, different options, and one answer is the correct one. So 10 questions, 18 minutes, pretty strong time pressure. Numerical reasoning is 10 questions and 20 minutes. So that is also somewhat cognitively heavy to calculate and interpret the data, reason, estimate, calculate. And then you have the abstract, which is often the most challenging one, 10 questions and 10 minutes, where it's different shapes and forms. You need to find the next one in a sequence. But as I said, it's pass-fail, and the combined pass mark is 15 out of 30. So if you completely mess up abstract reasoning and you only get one question correct, you are somewhat not very well performing in the numerical reasoning and you get, say, 9 questions right. Well, that's not a good example. That's not 10 questions. Let's take 5 questions right. Okay, so half of it you messed up, but you get 5 questions right. So we've got 6 points. But then with the verbal reasoning, 9 correct answers and you can still pass. So you mess up abstract, but verbal, you do great, you pass. Now, certainly you do not want to risk that. You want to perform at your highest possible performance, but there is this flexibility where you don't need to perform extremely high to be able to pass this particular component of the competition. The EU law test is more tricky because the EU law test, it determines a lot, given that we're talking about lawyer linguists, and there's not just the linguistic element, but the law, and you need to know EU law really, really well. And there is a pass mark, but also there's a ranking, and the ranking determines if eligibility is checked or not. So you need to perform really well. And not only that, you also need the weight of this particular component is 30% in the overall combined score. So this is really important. You have 60 minutes and then 30 questions. So 2 minutes per question. And that is, let's say, feasible because it's a knowledge test. So you need to know things, you need to recall things, you need to find the correct answer, but don't expect an easy test. So from case law, from institutional questions, from competence of the different levels of court, there could be many, many types of questions related to the procedure and way beyond. So this is a very important one. We, on EU training, already have a large number of EU knowledge tests, and we are looking to add a large number, 100, 200 EU law-related tests. So that is going to be available in a more concentrated format, but we also have broader EU knowledge tests already that are available on our site, so you can practice it. And the book, my recently released book, the EU Handbook, is available if you want to brush up on your understanding of the institutions and other aspects. We also have a very comprehensive chapter on the different decision-making procedures, including implementing and delegated acts. So there is a lot of reference in there. Now, having said that, let's go on and look at the language comprehension test. So language comprehension is 25 minutes, 12 questions, so based on one text. So that doesn't sound extremely challenging, but of course, it's also a very consequential and important component. 20% in the overall ranking, so in the weight of the overall scores. And I'm looking at, just to be sure that I share that properly. So language 2 and 3 for the English candidates. So for those who chose English as language 1, the language comprehension is done in language 2 and 3. Whereas for others, so basically for the 7 other profiles, it's in language 3, right? Sort of your weakest language, the language in which you still need to be fairly competent, but not necessarily native level. So having said that, what does it cover? Well, this is more than just a simple grammar test. So it's the grammar accuracy. It's about a socio-linguistic appropriateness. Is the right word, the right formula, the right presentation is used? And then assessing your reading skills. So generally saying, okay, does it read well? Does it read fluently? And then point out the mistakes, again, in a multiple choice format, most probably. And then revision test. That's another interesting one where it's 50% of the overall score. So this is another very important one. We are actually right now developing revision tests. So we want to be able to help your preparation. Hopefully this is going to be ready in a month or 2, I estimate. We're trying to produce it relatively fast, but we want to be sure that it fully corresponds to the kind of test and the kind of format that will be expected from candidates. So here you have 90 minutes, and it's for the English profile, it's in language 1, and language 1 and 2 in the other language profiles, right? So you need to revise a text which was originally written in English for the English ones, and for the others written in other languages. So this is a somewhat new format, but still it's being used already, I think, for translators. So it's not a completely radically new element for the linguistic kind of test, but a very important one where, given the fact that a large part of the job that you will be expected to do is revision, so they simulate that in the exam and see how well you do that. So just to recap there, for the non-English profile, so everyone, all the 700 profiles who didn't choose English as their language one, so you need to revise a translated text from English into the competition language, and you may as well need to translate. So that's an interesting part. You need to translate any untranslated text from language 2, meaning from English to the competition language. So there you need to basically localize it, so to say, and fully make it a high quality translation, and even translate parts which had not been translated. So this is not a proper translation test per se, but there are components in it that you need to translate if you are one of the 7 linguistic profiles. Now, what happens afterwards? Afterwards, there is the eligibility check, and there are different steps to it. And I won't spend too much time on it, because this essentially happens in the back by the selection board. Selection board is the group of people who are appointed or they volunteer to be part of the team that essentially supervises and runs a competition. So it's not EPSO in a legal sense, but the selection board. And the selection board does all of that. So EU law test is scored, and then eligibility checked for the top ranked 4 times of the number of spots reached. So essentially 100, or for the English language one, it's more. And then they check the eligibility, and then they proceed to the language and comprehension test, and then the final scores are calculated. So again, this happens in the back. Bottom line, you need to perform your very best at every component. A bit less for the abstract verbal numerical reasoning. There it's enough to pass, but for all the others, you really need to be at the top of your game. And then there's a final ranking, and that determines who gets on the reserve list. And when you are on the reserve list, you put the champagne in the fridge. You don't open it yet, because you're waiting for a specific job offer to land in your inbox or in a phone call. Though there are certain things you can proactively do to find a position. We actually have a webinar on that, on how to find an EU job once you're on the reserve list. And when you get a specific job offer, that's when you open the champagne, or perhaps a Belgian beer. And eligibility check is a couple of words on that. So it's really the selection board takes care of that based on the documents and based on your exam performance and on your declarations and how properly they are proven, backed up by specific documents. And then finally, there's a reserve list, which is, again, not a job specifically, but it's a prerequisite for you to be hired into this sort of position. And there are, you see, so they place the candidates there, but inside the reserve list, there's no ranking. So it's not like you're number 1 on the list, you're going to be hired faster, or you're number 25, you're going to be hired later. It's really being on the reserve list. It gives the right to the institutions to hire you from that list. Voila. I think we've covered a lot. And then in a nutshell, before we get to the questions, and I see that you really woke up, had your sandwich lunch, and got into question mode. So I'm going to answer many of those questions in a moment. But just to how to get the job, well, practicing intensively, whether it's 1 hour a day or 10 hours a week, and it might be more or less depending on where you are now, how much you know about EU law right now, how comfortable you are with revision and language comprehension now. All those variables can be factored in. By the way, we have on the EU training website a free handy tool called EU or EPSO Preparation Planner. So that is something you can look up, and you can feed in a couple of variables of where you feel your weaknesses might be, how much time you have until the exam, and then it generates a nice basic preparation schedule for you that you might want to consider. And then staying persistent and really doing lots of simulations. especially on areas and on topics where you feel that your performance is not as good as you would like that to be. We have lots of webinars with free beginners guides and some pro tips, whether it's the abstract verbal numerical, and then lots of articles and news that we regularly publish. And by the way, we also do Ask Me Anything webinars, which is broad, not specifically for this competition, but for any other. And there's one coming up in a couple of days. So if you would like to tune in, you're more than welcome. That's a free event. We do that with Luke, who himself used to work for EPSO. So there was the Ultimate EU Textbook. And now I can say publicly, so to say, that we're coming up with a slightly revised new version, the 2025 edition of the EU Textbook, which is going to have the same questions, but some additional chapters, some refining, and some questions needed to be corrected or clarified. So we do that too. It should be coming out, I think, around April. That is the most likely. April, end of April rather, or early May. Okay, so there are Facebook groups and there are different practice tests. Now, important to mention that some of this we don't necessarily have yet. As I hinted at it earlier, the EU law, we're just adding that in a couple of weeks. And the language comprehension we have for most languages, not all, but we might add even more. So all of that is coming, and we're going to be giving you a 15% discount, and we will email you as soon as all of those practice tests are available. So with that, I will probably just keep this one on screen and answer many questions, as many as I can. We were pretty efficient with time, so we have time. Okay, can I use for EU law test as language 1? Then, other than the language of competition. So basically your question is, in which language is the EU law test in? Right now, I need to actually go back because I don't want to say something that doesn't hold. And honestly, I'm myself a little lost with all the languages. That's why we put that on the slides. So I'm just coming back to see here is the EU law test. That's language 1. So, okay. So language 1 is the one in which the EU law test will be run, meaning any of the competition's 8 languages practically. So you need to choose that. And you don't have a choice to pick another language. So if your exam, the profile that you picked is Greek, well, then you don't have a choice but to sit the EU law test in that language. Okay, here's another one. Is it EU law only or more general EU knowledge? Because the notice of competition says EU law. Yeah, the notice of competition says EU law. Now, EU law is still a somewhat versatile and malleable concept. So it's not limited in a strict sense to EU laws and legislation and procedures and legal concepts and case law. It may relate to, I wouldn't say EU policies per se, but perhaps how a certain policy was adopted, or the European Commission has its own better lawmaking procedure. So the kind of the internal kitchen inside the Commission, which again, strictly speaking, it's a legal matter of what the rules of procedure says or what the internal lawmaking processes are inside the different institutions. So EU law, again, in a fairly broad sense, and not just what you might intuitively think EU law constitutes. Next one, will all these tests be scheduled in one go, or will there be space? Well, one go in the sense that they're all on the same day, but there are pauses in between, bathroom breaks, and you can get a sandwich or coffee or what have you. So there are pauses in between, and they communicate that in advance to you, so you know what time the abstract verbal numerical is, when the language comprehension is, when the EU law is, etc. Angela is asking, deadline for submitting supporting document only September. Does that mean the exams will only take place in autumn? Well, chances are yes. So there's no guarantee it's going to happen before the summer, but it's very hard to predict, really hard to predict. They might as well have the exam in July, but by the time they actually correct those, it's not going to happen before the 15th of September. So there's no hard rule to say the exam will not happen before, but it's going to be somewhat closer to that time. And it might be June, July, but it might be September for that matter. Next one, Barbara is asking, they require documents to be uploaded on a new unique portal. Does this refer to degrees? Yes, if the documents, supporting documents need to be uploaded, then degrees or any other, maybe citizenship, again, just to prove that you're an EU citizen, but it doesn't immediately translate into the linguistic choice, or other documents that are necessary for you to show or demonstrate your work experience or any other. Samuel is asking, does my degree count as 4 years if one of those years was an Erasmus year, which formed part of the degree? Well, if it's part of the formal education and it's an official time that you spent as an Erasmus student in another place, the fact that it was Erasmus, I think that's a secondary issue. So if your formal degrees and the number of years or half a year that you spent there is actually counted inside the degree, then by all means, that sounds like it's good. Okay, Dora is asking, I have a law degree from university in Italy, which is recognized in Croatia. After that, I passed the bar exam in Croatia. I've been working as a judicial advisor at a court in Croatia for 5 years. So I didn't obtain my degree in the country for which language I want to apply. Can I still participate? Right, that's a tricky one. So basically, your degree has been recognized in Croatia. Yeah, these are the moments when I'm hesitant as a snap judgment and as a snap reply and say anything, because ultimately, to me, it seems that this would qualify because it's been recognized, but again, it's not formally issued in that particular country. So again, I'd be a bit wary. This is something you might want to ask on the EPSO contact form and try to get them to give you some guidance. And chances are they might come up based on experience with previous competitions. When there were such open questions where many candidates were affected by questions like yours, which again is not your individual situation, it's more generic, whether a recognized degree isn't considered the same as a degree issued in that same country. That is something where they might put out some guidance or FAQs in the next couple of weeks to be sure that this is clear for everyone. So again, I'm very cautious to say yes or no to this right off the top of my head. Emmy is asking, my degree in law is not from the country corresponding to the language, but with the degree proof, right? Okay, with a qualification as an expert in the language. Would it qualify? Again, I can say the same answer. Ask for clarification, because these are the edge cases where it seems it should be so, because you have everything what it takes to like, you possess the linguistic and legal knowledge in that particular country. But again, whatever I say, that's not going to commit anyone. Best to ask the selection board. They need to give you some indication on that. All right, how do you judge the chances to pass? 25 positions, not huge. By experience, how many people usually apply for such competitions? Yes, very valid question. Largely depends on the language. So if you take Danish for that matter, it's just typically how many Danes are motivated or willing to do this sort of job and move to Brussels or Luxembourg is more limited than other countries where the job market is very different, or the salary difference between what the EU offers and what they might earn as lawyers back home is large. That generates a lot of interest. So a lot depends on those factors, and hard to say anything which is true across the board. So it's the country, the language, the candidate's motivation that really determines how many applicants there are for any given profile. Okay, from Ricarda, do you think chances are higher to make it on the reserve list for English or one of the other languages? I would guess other languages would have a higher chance of succeeding, because those who may not fit in one linguistic profile or another would likely resort to English as a backup option, provided that they qualify and provided that they meet the criteria. So English is kind of the jolly joker of among the languages, because that is where many people can go to if they cannot choose others. again, provided they meet the other criteria. So in that sense, if you have a chance to pick one of the others, I would probably go for that. How can I prep for the EU law test? I saw from the corner of my eyes that my colleagues were kind enough to link there the EU course, which is the e-learning course, 14 hours of e-learning course on our site where we really go through basically the same topics as the EU handbook, but in a visual and e-learning format, history, procedures, and institutions. And then certainly you can go much deeper. You can take the Craig de Burka book on EU law and case law, and you can really take it two notches further if you think that would be necessary for your preparation. For the English revision test, do you foresee that we will have to revise a regulation directive decision? Any suggestions on how to prepare for the revision test? Yeah, so for the revision, yes, I wouldn't exclude the possibility that it's a formal legal text. It could be a court judgment, for that matter. It could even be, say, a memorandum of understanding. It could be some other type of pretty heavy legal text. And what's my advice for preparation? We actually are now working with some linguists to develop those tests. And I'm just thinking what would be helpful advice in this context. You could even work with someone who understands how legal texts are being translated, and then the person can generate or create using, whether it's using AI or whether it's just simply taking as a baseline some EU related text and purposefully putting mistakes or errors or mistranslations in it. And then you can practice with that, and you can reciprocate that approach with that friend with their language. So it's basically creating mock revisions, or you volunteer and work with a translation office and then do that sort of practice yourself. That's off the top of my head, but certainly there are other and better methods besides this. Anne is asking, will the language comprehension test be like the language comprehension test for AD5 translator? The chances are, yes, very similar, but perhaps the text itself will be much more legal and law-based. But in its nature, we are not expecting anything radically different. So that is probably a good example to look at. Alexandra is asking, how much time would you estimate between the results of the reasoning and the day of EU law test? Well, it's on the same day. So it's not like on separate days. It's all going to be a sequence. So there is some pauses and stuff, but it's not on a separate day. But the results, they all come out essentially at the same time, most likely, unless they communicate. If you didn't pass the reasoning one, they might let you know in advance, though I would suspect that they communicate the results for everyone at the same time. Okay, you mentioned that developing practice questions over the next 2 months based on past competition. What's your best guess of the exam date? Like I said earlier, so it's very hard to estimate, but I'm not expecting an exam before June, July. And then again, if it's not happening until the 20th July, essentially it's not going to happen before September or the very, very, very end of August, but more likely September. So that means that means what it means. That there's not more I can say about that. It's really hard to estimate, but these are roughly the considerations that I would suggest you look at. Nadine, I have a British passport, law degree in Spain, master in Belgium, but followed in English. Am I eligible? Whew, that's a truly European story, right? Like all three are from different countries. Honestly, again, I wouldn't just quickly tell you whether you're eligible or not. I'd need to look at all those variables, but that's something I would encourage you to do based on everything we covered so far and notice of competition, and then see whether there's one criterion or another that may not hold water. Raluca is asking, can I correct my application if I send it already? Well, I'd rather suggest you wait. You do a draft, you can save it, and then you send it in a couple of days before the 10th of April. because correcting it or changing it may not be allowed, might be allowed until the deadline, but chances are once you send it in, they probably would not give you that option. In which language will be the reasoning test? Language 1? I think so, right? Let me cheat a bit. There we go. We had here. Language 1, indeed. So language 1 is in which the verbal numerical abstract reasoning is. Now, for abstract reasoning, it's really not important because it's the images. Numerical, slightly important, but again, less so. Where it really matters is the verbal reasoning. I'm happy to let you know we have hundreds and sometimes even thousands of verbal reasoning tests in all 24 official EU languages. So you will find all those languages on our site to practice with. Gregor is asking, since work experience is not required, will I have to provide supporting documents for all my work experience? For example, I have some done translation work, might not have a formal proof. Now, this, since if the work experience doesn't apply for you, given your qualification that you have 4 years of studies in law, and in that case, there's no work experience required. If that is the case, then you don't need to prove anything further in the selection procedure. So then you meet the formal qualification criterion as such. Where the work experience can play a role is much later at the recruiting phase, at the hiring phase. So when you are hired into a new job, then you need, or you may more than need to, want to prove that you have certain work experience, because that has a small impact on your salary, in which so-called step you are placed based on work experience. Janet is asking, where language 1 is English, do you think the language comprehension test for language 2 and language 3 will be equal in terms of difficulty, or language 2 harder than language 3? Whew, that is a difficult one. Normally, I would say language 3 could be less difficult, given that the required level is somewhat lower than it is for language 1 and 2. Now, whether inside the test, how that might manifest, honestly, I cannot predict. I'd rather say that instead of guessing and then missing it. Cannot predict. Typically, as an approach, what I advise is prepare for something more difficult, and you'll be positively surprised. Always better than expecting something light, and then it happens the other way around. Ricarda, reasoning skills knowledge tests are on one day, language comprehension revision test later on. No, everything is on one day. So everything happens on a single day with some pauses in between, but it's not spread out over multiple days. At least this is what we know now, okay? I actually add that big caveat. This is what we know now. And the reason I add that caveat is that actually right now, there's a translator exam happening, and some of you may be enrolled in that. And they actually split that into 2 days. So certain parts were on day 1, which already happened. And the next part is, when is it? 13. So I think it's on, what is that? Thursday, when the next part of the translator exam is happening. So it's the same exam, but they split that over 2 days. So that's a big caveat I would add, that this might be the case also for this particular competition as well. We shall see, but they will communicate that to you in due course. And Luna is asking, what if we pass this competition and are already working in the commission, will be hired automatically as an official in our current position? That is not a given. So that is not an automatic thing, because the units and the different departments have certain numbers and indicators of how many vacancies they have or how many people they can hire. It also depends on under which contract you are, whether you're cast, so contract agent or temporary agent. So there are some variables. So it's not an automatic thing that your position is converted into a permanent post. It's a very positive thing if it is, and entirely possible, but it's not an automatically given situation. Okay, maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we call it a day. So Julia is asking, it's better to choose as language 4 for reasoning test, English? I think you wanted to say language 1. Okay, and Romanian, translating that. Okay, that's a little complicated for me to quickly grasp the point, but Julia, if we can help, send us a message. We'll look into it in more depth. And then maybe 1 or 2 questions that I missed. Here, there are a couple others which I try to process quickly. Maybe this one. Would you say that the newly released book, EU Handbook, is enough to study as main study for the EU knowledge test? Can you please suggest other materials? Honestly, for this competition, I think you need more. So that I really trust is a very good baseline and a very solid framework to use. But for the law tests, you need actually more because it's really going to go very deep into the things that I mentioned. So there are some kind of legal Bibles that, like I mentioned, the Craig, the Burka was in my time, but I think it still exists. You might want to look at a book that a very good friend of mine, Victor Luszcz, that's Luszcz. He's got a difficult to spell name, Polish origin. He published called European Court Procedure. Now, you probably don't need that level of depth, but again, if you want to go further, that's a great book because it focuses on the court, but again, from a very legal procedural perspective. And there are a couple of other EU law related books that you might want to check. And those really take it further and further when it comes to the EU law part. So with that, I think we are gonna stop here, and I truly thank you for your attention. Big thanks to David in the room who helped me put this together. Big thanks to Balázs. Big thanks to India. Big thanks to Rita, who really worked very diligently on helping me with the slides and all the content. So thank you so much for being here. We will follow up as soon as those additional tests are ready and released, and with our promised 15% off. And besides that, if we can be helpful with anything else, then send us a message through the support channels. Again, when it comes to eligibility, we're very cautious because we're not EPSO, we're not the selection board. So first, really look at those. And if you can, you might want to contact the selection board for specific guidance. Not necessarily whether you qualify or not, but as a broader question that if someone's degree has been has the equivalent in another country, is that accepted as such, or what repercussions does it have? With that, wishing you good luck. Hope to see you in Brussels or Luxembourg as an EU official in a couple of months, and let us know if we can help with anything else. Thank you so much, and the slides will be sent shortly in a day or two. Have a nice day.